The square is silent, but it's a heavy, breathing silence. Thousands of eyes are fixed on the crude wooden platform at its center, where a man stands bound, his face pale against the gray London sky. It is not the silence of respect, but of morbid, hungry anticipation. The air, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and fear, hangs still. The muffled clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby street is the only sound that dares to break the spell, a rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic beating of hearts in the crowd. This is not just an execution, it is a spectacle, a piece of theater meticulously designed by the state, and every person here has a role to play. The condemned is the star, the executioner his co-star, and the crowd is the chorus, here to witness a story of power, betrayal, and savage justice. Few outside the city, and even fewer in the centuries to come, would ever learn the intricate, brutal anatomy of what was about to unfold. This wasn't a simple hanging or a swift beheading. This was the punishment reserved for the ultimate crime, high treason. A punishment so calculated in its cruelty, so layered in its symbolism, that it was meant to destroy not just the body, but the very soul and memory of the traitor. It was a legal ritual, a political statement, and a terrifying warning etched into the mind of every subject. What they are about to witness is the law of the land, taken to its most horrific and logical conclusion. If you enjoy uncovering history's darker chapters, remember to like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Unquote. To understand the scene in that London square, we must first understand the medieval mind. In an age defined by a rigid, divine hierarchy, the king was more than a ruler. He was God's anointed deputy on earth. His body was not just his own, it was the embodiment of the kingdom itself. To commit treason, therefore, was not merely a political act. It was a blasphemous one. It was an act of cosmic rebellion, an attempt to shatter the sacred chain of being that connected every soul, from the lowest peasant to the angels in heaven. This belief transformed the traitor from a simple criminal into a heretic, a monster who threatened the stability of the world itself. And for such a monstrous crime, an equally monstrous punishment was deemed necessary. The sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered finds its roots in the brutal reign of King Edward I, the infamous Longshanks. While solidifying English law, he also sought to make visceral examples of his enemies. The first high-profile victim was the Welsh prince Dafydd ap Gruffydd in 1283, followed famously by the Scottish patriot William Wallace in 1305. Their public executions were not born of simple rage. They were calculated acts of political theater. The punishment was meticulously crafted to address every facet of the traitor's crime. It was a legal formula for annihilation. This specific sentence was reserved for common men. Noble traitors were often afforded the privilege of a swifter beheading. Women, considered the gentler sex, were typically burned at the stake, a fate deemed less publicly indecent, though no less agonizing. But for the common man who dared to defy his king, the state reserved its most elaborate and soul-chilling performance. The very name hanged, drawn, and quartered is a chillingly sterile summary of a protracted, multi-stage ritual. Each stage was steeped in symbolism, designed to systematically unmake a man in the most public and humiliating way imaginable, ensuring his name would be a curse on the lips of generations to come. The day of the traitor's unmaking begins not with a swift walk to the gallows, but with a slow, agonizing journey. He is dragged from the cold security of his cell, often in the Tower of London, and brought into the jarring light of day. Here, there is no merciful cart or wagon. Instead, he is met by a hurdle, a simple wooden frame, like a fence panel, sometimes with a cowhide stretched over it. He is lashed to this frame, his back against the rough wood, and tied to the back of a horse. This is the first act of the ritual, the drawing. Not drawing as in being pulled apart by horses, a common misconception, but being drawn, or dragged, through the filth-strewn streets of the city to the place of execution. The journey is a calculated torment. The horse moves at a walking pace, ensuring the spectacle lasts for hours. Cobblestones, sharp rocks, and the frozen ruts of the road tear at the man's back and flesh through his thin tunic. The crowd is an ever-present monster, lining the route for miles. They are not silent observers. They hurl insults, rotten food, animal waste, and stones. It is a gauntlet of public shame, designed to strip away the last vestiges of the man's dignity long before he reaches the scaffold. Every jolt, every cry of pain, every vile word thrown at him is part of the sentence. He arrives at the execution site, perhaps Smithfield or the notorious Tyburn, not as a man, but as a broken, bleeding effigy of treason, already half dead from the ordeal. This procession serves a dual purpose. It punishes the condemned and serves as a mobile warning to every citizen who witnesses it. The message is clear. This is the fate of those who defy the crown. At the gallows, a new phase of horror begins. The man, barely conscious, is cut from the hurdle and hauled onto the platform. His sentence is read aloud for all to hear, a formal declaration of his crimes against the king and God. Then, the noose is placed around his neck. But this is not the hanging that offers the quick relief of a broken neck. The medieval gallows is often a shorter drop. The purpose here is not to kill, but to inflict the agony of near death. He is pushed from the ladder or turned off the cart, and the rope snaps taut. His world dissolves into a chaotic, suffocating darkness. He struggles, his body convulsing at the end of the rope, life fighting to hold on. The crowd watches, mesmerized, as he is strangled, suspended between the living world and the next. And then, just as unconsciousness offers its final escape, he is cut down. He crashes to the platform, gasping, choking, his lungs burning as they drag in air. He is alive. This is the cruelest part of the design, the brief, false flicker of hope. In this disoriented, half-strangled state, he is seized and stripped naked. He is then forced onto a butcher's block, held down for all to see. Now, the executioner, who, until this point had been a distant figure, becomes an intimate agent of the state's vengeance. This is where the term drawn takes on its second, more gruesome meaning. Disembowelment. The executioner takes up a knife. The crowd, which had been a roaring beast, often falls into a hushed, collective gasp. First comes the symbolic emasculation, a brutal act meant to sever the traitor's lineage from the earth, ensuring his name and bloodline die with him. Then, while he is still conscious, the executioner makes a long, deep incision across his abdomen. What follows is the centerpiece of the horror, the part meant to sear itself into the memory of every onlooker. The executioner reaches into the man's body and pulls out his entrails, handful by handful. According to the law, the traitor was supposed to see his own bowels burned before his eyes. A brazier or a fire is kept ready on the scaffold for this very purpose. The organs, the seat of passion and life, are thrown into the flames. This is a moment of heavy religious symbolism. The traitor's corrupt inner self is purged by fire, a foretaste of the eternal damnation that awaits his soul. The acrid smell of burning flesh fills the air, a scent no one in the crowd will ever forget. It is the smell of treason being cleansed from the kingdom. Only now, after this protracted torment, is the traitor granted the mercy of death. His heart, said to be the source of his wicked betrayal, is cut from his chest and often held aloft by the executioner for the crowd to see. Then, finally, his head is severed from his body with an axe. The spectacle, however, is far from over. Death has not paid the traitor's debt to the crown. His lifeless body is then tied to horses, or simply hacked apart by the executioner, and dismembered into 4 pieces. This is the quartering. Each part of this process is a direct symbolic rebuttal of the traitor's ambition. He who sought to tear the kingdom apart is himself torn apart. He who sought to raise himself above his station is brought lower than the basest animal. His body, once a temple for the soul. The show is over, but the story lingers. The crowd disperses, carrying the sights and smells of the day with them. They are now the unwilling messengers of the crown's power. Their hushed conversations in taverns and homes, spreading the tale of the traitor's end, far wider than any royal decree ever could. For weeks, the event is the talk of the city. Parents point up at the traitor's head on London Bridge, a grim and effective lesson for their children on the virtues of obedience. The dismembered limbs, rotting in public view in distant cities, serve as constant, festering reminders that the king's justice has no borders within his realm. No corner of the kingdom is safe for those who contemplate treason. This grisly practice was not a fleeting medieval fad. It remained the statutory punishment for high treason in England for over 500 years. Men like Guy Fawkes, the infamous gunpowder plotter, were sentenced to this fate. Though he cheated the executioner's full artistry by leaping from the gallows and breaking his neck, the ritual evolved slowly over the centuries, becoming slightly less barbaric in its execution. But the sentence itself remained on the books. It was a powerful tool of state control, a form of psychological warfare waged against its own populace. The goal was not merely to eliminate an enemy, but to terrorize any potential future enemies into submission. The punishment's very extremity, however, eventually contributed to its downfall. As public sensibilities shifted with the dawn of the Enlightenment, what was once seen as divine justice began to be viewed as barbaric cruelty. The spectacle that had once enthralled and terrified crowds began to inspire pity and disgust. The final full sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering was carried out in the early 19th century. By 1870, the Forfeiture Act finally abolished it, replacing it with the simple act of hanging. The era of state-sponsored theatrical butchery had ended, leaving behind a legacy written in blood and fear. A stark testament to a time when justice was not only blind, but utterly without mercy. The head on the spike is more than a warning. It is the final, silent word in a brutal conversation about power. A human being, with a name, a family, and a story, is reduced to a piece of political architecture, a grotesque ornament meant to keep the living in line. The anatomy of this death was the anatomy of fear itself, meticulously designed to unmake a man in body and soul, and scatter his memory to the winds. It forces us to ask a difficult question. Where is the line between justice and state-sanctioned terror? That's the true story most people never hear. What's your take on it? Let us know in the comments.